In this video, we will discuss the origins and history of Judaism. As we begin talking about Judaism, or the Jewish religious tradition, it's important to establish some terminology. To begin with, we want to mention that Judaism can both be seen as a religion and a culture or a people group. Karl Ehrlich notes, quote, "The term Israel denotes a historic political entity, a people, a nation, a belief system, a social group, a culture," end quote. As you can see here, Judaism, or the term Israel, is much more than just a religious tradition. As we talk about Judaism in this video, we are mostly focusing on the religious tradition, but remember that this idea of Jewish identity and the cultural aspect plays a big role in this as well. The word Judaism functions as a noun. This is the encompassing religious tradition that we will be talking about. Jew is somebody who is part of this tradition. Again, this word is a noun, but this is somebody who adheres to Judaism. And the term Jewish is an adjective describing something. So when we talk about a holiday and say it's a Jewish holiday, we're noting that this is part of the Jewish religious tradition called Judaism. We also want to make some distinctions between Israel, Israelite, and Israeli. Israel, as you noted with Karl Ehrlich's quote, can mean a lot of different things. When we talk about Israel, we're usually talking about this people group or the area of Israel, whether ancient Israel or the state of Israel today. When we talk about an Israelite, we're talking about somebody who lived in ancient Israel before the destruction of the temples. And when we talk about an Israeli, we're talking about somebody who lives in or is from modern-day Israel, beginning in 1948. One of the foundational concepts for ancient Judaism is the idea of the covenant. A covenant is literally a contract between two or more parties, in which each promises to uphold certain terms. These covenants can have equal parties or unequal parties, where one is in charge and the other mostly just agrees to uphold certain terms in order to be protected or provided for. In Judaism, what we see is the establishment of covenants with the Jewish God. In the Jewish text, we see this God referred to as Elohim, which we translate in English to God, or Yahweh. Yahweh, the Hebrew word, is often not spelled out in recognition of the divinity of the name, and so we often will see it in just capital letters, YHWH. By not including the vowels, many Jews believe that this follows the commandment of not using the Lord's name in vain, simply not repeating the divine name, often using Adonai, which means Lord, as a substitution. One of the most important covenants that we see is the Abrahamic covenant. This covenant was created with Abraham in Genesis, and we see an emphasis on a major population being produced from Abraham and his lineage. We see this beginning in Genesis chapter 12. In verse 2, the Lord, Yahweh, says, "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." What we see here is this promise that Abraham will have many descendants. And this covenant is often important for Jews to understand that they are a people group and have some kind of identity as such. One of the other important covenants that we see is the Mosaic covenant. This is the covenant established with Moses in Exodus. We have the story of the enslaved Israelites in Egypt, and Moses ends up leading these Israelites out of slavery and bondage. And this becomes really the foundation of the monotheistic religion of Judaism. Up until this point, we see some disagreement on whether Judaism is monotheistic, polytheistic, or henotheistic, meaning there are multiple gods, but there's one chief god. But we see after the Exodus that Judaism becomes a concept in itself and becomes monotheistic. One of the ways that the Jews uphold the Mosaic covenant is through following commandments. And these commandments in Hebrew are mitzvot. The commandments are essential for preserving Jewish identity. When we talk about Judaism, one of the key focuses is the idea of having a certain identity, that these are people set apart or separated from everyone else. And Jewish identity comes about by keeping certain commandments. We have the 10 Commandments as part of the Mosaic Covenant, as well as many more that come afterwards. When we talk about Israelite history, we have to talk about the monarchy and the political entity that was ancient Israel. Israel begins as a theocracy with this idea that God, Yahweh, is governing the Jewish people. But eventually this transitions to a monarchy, and this begins with King Saul, then David, then Solomon, before the split between Israel and Judah. We see in Genesis that Jacob, who's also named Israel, has 12 sons, and these become the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the tribes, Judah, becomes the tribe of the monarchy. It's understood that any legitimate ruler in Israelite history in the monarchy would come from the tribe of Judah. We also see an emphasis on religion working right alongside the rulership. While the rulers were religious as well, there were also high priests and a priesthood who were responsible for the religious upkeep of the people, making sacrifices in the temple, and so on. And the high priests and the priesthood were from the tribe of Levi. They were Levites. For several centuries, the Israelite monarchy functioned for governing an autonomous nation. There was a united monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon before it split into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah, with each having their own separate monarchy. After this happened, each, Israel and Judah, were autonomous for a short period of time before there was pressure from outside nations like Assyria and Babylon. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel succumbed to this pressure and was conquered by Assyria. But the temple, which was the central focus of ancient Judaism, because it was where sacrifices were made to Yahweh, and in many cases where Yahweh was believed to reside. In 586 BCE, this temple that was located in the southern kingdom of Judah, in the city of Jerusalem, was conquered and destroyed by the Babylonians. The destruction of the first temple brought about a major crisis for ancient Judaism. The Jews thought that Yahweh either resided in this temple or had some kind of central focus on it. And if this happened, they wondered whether Yahweh was dead or whether he cared about them at all. So the Jews at this point, 586 BCE, lose their first temple, and they go into what we call the Babylonian exile, also called the diaspora. The diaspora we'll talk about here in a moment, but it becomes a major changing point for ancient Judaism. Around the year 517 BCE, the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, and The Persians, who were primarily Zoroastrian, allowed for religious pluralism, and Cyrus the Great in 538 BCE allowed the Israelites to return to their homeland of Jerusalem. And around the year 517 BCE, Darius the Great allowed and even provided for the Jews to rebuild their temple. So approximately 517 BCE is when we see the Second Temple period and the reconstruction of the temple. Now this temple lasts for about 500 to 600 years. During this time, we have the Greeks take over the Persian Empire, and eventually the Roman Empire rises. While the Israelites and Judahites maintained autonomy up until 586 BCE, when the temple was rebuilt, they had some autonomy as a political nation, but they mostly were functioning as a type of city-state under the Persian Empire and then under the Hellenistic Empire and so on. In the year 70 CE, after a lot of religious conflict and conflict with the Romans, the Roman Empire destroyed the Second Temple, and the Jews were left without a temple forever. So 70 CE is the year of the destruction of the Second Temple, and up to 2019, we still don't have a reconstruction of the temple. Both periods, after the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BCE and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, led to major crises for the Israelites. In both periods, the Israelites were exiled from their homeland and wondered how to follow Yahweh and how to preserve their Jewish identity after the temple, which was so important to them, was destroyed. We see diaspora communities form after both of these periods. The word diaspora literally means dispersion of people from their homeland, and you can see how the word comes from disperse. These Israelites would establish new communities in places outside of Israel and Judah because they were exiled from there. We see diaspora communities form, and with this formation, we see a new emphasis on the Torah. The Torah is the Jewish law, contained in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And this focus on textual worship, essentially, becomes a new emphasis for the people in these diaspora communities. Since they can't worship God in the temple anymore, they start using the Torah as a new form of worship. And there's this new emphasis on textual worship there. This also comes about through synagogues, or in Hebrew, Bet Knesset, which literally means house of assembly. So these synagogues, or houses of assembly, become new gathering places for the Israelites to pray to God, and worship through their text of the Torah. We also see the rise of a new class of religious leaders. These leaders are called rabbis, and this begins the rabbinic movement that continues throughout a lot of Jewish history. Rabbi literally means teacher, and a rabbi is a teacher of Hebrew law or Torah and scripture. The rabbis became the people who preserved Jewish tradition, whether it was oral law or textual tradition, and they created schools for training often Jewish children, but also for training new rabbis. And these schools were called yeshiva. Throughout Jewish history, we see a major focus on persecution, particularly on this people group who are claimed to be God's chosen people according to the Hebrew Bible, who are persecuted relentlessly because of their identity. We refer to this as anti-Semitism. Semitic is a word given to people groups in the Middle Eastern areas, and this name has become equivalent with anti-Jewishness, and is a form of both racism as well as a lack of acceptance of a person's religion. Over time, this anti-Semitism has formed less as a religious issue and more as an issue of race and identity. Now, Jewish identity is essential for the ancient Israelites as well as modern-day Jews. So this persecution was targeting specifically who they were as people, their race, their religious beliefs, ethnicity, and so on. We see this in the Hellenistic period, which is the Greek period beginning in the 4th century BCE. The Greeks under Antiochus Epiphanes IV, as well as other leaders, wanted to force the Jews to assimilate into their culture and essentially remove all of their Jewish identity. We see this continuing through the Crusades. The First Crusade, which was a Christian-motivated capture of the Holy Land, ended in the slaughter of many Jews and Muslims. In 1099, we see the siege of Jerusalem, which is artistically pictured here. And this crusade was targeted for recapturing the Holy Land, but also targeted for persecuting and killing as many Jews as possible, as well as Muslims, because of this anti-Semitism and religious intolerance. In 1941 through 1945 CE, we see the Holocaust, which is called in Hebrew HaShoah, which literally means the catastrophe. And this is one of the peaks of anti-Semitism, where we see a Jewish population systematically oppressed and killed because of their identity and their race. After thousands of years of persecution and approximately 2,000 years of a lack of political autonomy, the Israelites, who we now call Israelis, finally gained political autonomy with the formation of the State of Israel. On May 14, 1948, the State of Israel was declared as a nation that had political autonomy. Today, approximately 75% of the population of the State of Israel identifies with Judaism, or the Jewish religious tradition. Whether this is religious or cultural, or both, is unclear, but this 75% population makes up a very large majority of the people who are Israelis today. Now that we have reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the origins of early Judaism and important features of the historical tradition, identify key events that affected the shift in Judaism from temple-focused to text and community-focused, and describe the rabbinic movement and how it arose out of ancient Judaism.